Speech, Power, and Consequence. I'm your host, Amelia Metz, and today we're going to walk through a Supreme Court decision that was just dropped in March of 2026. And it's one that can reshape how the states look at LGBTQ plus rights in the youth, and we're going to talk about how that can impact social change. So joining me is Dr. Karen Lindsey. She is an assistant professor of strategic communications at Elon University. Can you give me a little bit of your background and what kind of work you do?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this important case, and social change is my passion, of course. I started at Elon about 4.5 years ago, and I was teaching a course called Inclusive Communications, a 2-credit, now required course, and I realized that half semester is not nearly long enough to talk about and engage in all the topics related to social change. So I created a course called Social Change and Strategic Communication so that we could really examine what are some of the issues, what are some things that we need to know about historic movements, what are some of the things that we can do as people who might be involved in social change. And even the fact that we don't really understand the difference between social change and social justice, which was a big thing for me in creating this class. So that's a little bit about what I've done here at Elon. Of course, I am a researcher, and I research the intersections of race, gender, and leadership, and that encompasses a lot. So that is my passion. I'm writing my second book about that very topic. And so again, these ideas of social change, communications, leadership, it's all connected, whether it's a court case or whether it's a student studying or whether it's somebody who wants to have boots on the ground and be involved in a social movement. So that's a little bit about me.
So we can jump straight into the case. So the case we're talking about is Chiles v. Salazar. It was decided on March 31st of this year. Kaylee Chiles was a licensed mental health therapist in Colorado, and Colorado had made a law banning conversion therapy or sexual orientation change efforts. And the way that this law was written, it had said that a minor can go into a therapy office and say, I'm gay and I want to be more comfortable with that. And that was okay. But if they went into the office and said, I'm gay and I want to change that, that's where it was not okay. So Kaylee Chiles had challenged this law, saying that that's a violation of her First Amendment right because it's a viewpoint-based discrimination. And we can get into that a little bit more later of the difference between a viewpoint-based discrimination and a content-based regulation. But she took it to the lower courts, and they said that it was conduct. And they cited NIFLA v. Becerra, but NIFLA v. Becerra says that you don't have any less speech just because it's professional speech. However, there is conduct in that can be considered an overlap of speech. So she then took it to the Supreme Court, and they heard oral arguments, and then there was a decision on March 31st to send it back to the lower courts, but they said that they would have to look at it through the lens of strict scrutiny because they did not do that in their decision.
So I think what's most interesting about this case is, of course, it was an 8-1 ruling. And when you think about who the dissenting vote was, of course, it was the black woman, Ketanji Jackson. And so I think it's really interesting when we think about any kind of case involving any of the big 8 identities as I identify them, and LGBTQ plus is one of them, that you'll notice that women and minority or people of color typically can relate to any of the big 8 identities. Of course, we know there are intersections in many of those identities, but it's so important to note that this ruling speaks to where our court is right now in terms of the lopsided nature of how votes are coming down politically, more so than by the strict scrutiny of the law and fairness and all of that. And so I think that it's a time in our society and in politics where we really have to think about decisions that we're making personally, but how these court decisions are really very much based on who is on the court and how politicized the court has become now. It's no longer, in my opinion, purely opinion, my opinion, it's no longer a neutral kind of body that votes on things based on the actual arguments and the cases. It's now something that everybody's looking at it because it's political. Every decision they make right now has become political, and that's rather disappointing to me, but that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I would say that the 8-1 decision really shows that where we are in our legal system. I think that that really shows that we have a procedural justice system instead of a substantive justice system, which means that as long as you follow the process to get there, we think that that's justice. It may not be necessarily the most moral outcome or the best outcome, but our legal system says as long as you follow these steps and you go by the letter of the law, you're going to get justice. So I'm really interested in talking about how that can look forward for social change. Being in a legal system that really focuses on procedural justice, how can that kind of be a downfall for social change?
Well, it is a big downfall for social change, but we know, and we'll talk about, I think, later, this idea of what's the framework for social change. And one of the elements really requires us to think about social change as a long-term commitment. And so while there will often be setbacks, legal, social, whatever it is, there will be setbacks when you're committed to social change. But it really speaks to, again, how do you ensure that you have individuals who will stay with the issue, the topic, whatever it is, for longer term. It might not happen in my lifetime or your lifetime, but it's like we're not going to let this go until some change happens. And so I think that that's really important for us to consider when we think about social change and what this all means in terms of following the letter of the law. I also think when we think about systems and structures, we know that systems and structures, particularly laws or institutions, they weren't built with people of differing identities in mind. They were built on patriarchal systems, white males, and so it's not necessarily that they were considering how would this affect a woman, how would this affect someone of a different racial identity, a person with a different sexual orientation. So we're following the letter of the law of laws and ideas that never had us in mind. And so I think that's our challenge when we think about structural versus procedural and how that plays out.
So mentioning social change and the steps to get there, in class we've talked about how there's 3 elements to get to social change. You have your organizational infrastructure, engaged individuals, and political opportunity. Can you walk us through what that looks like in the context of this case for each of those elements?
Sure. I think when I think about engaged individuals, of course, there is a group of people that this law and this entire topic affects. But I also think that we often forget about many of our social change movements also gained momentum because when we think about engaged individuals, it's not just the people or the identities involved. It was also a word we overuse, allies, people who maybe were not identifying the same way. If I don't identify as you, you don't identify as me, I can still be part of that movement. I can still be part of that change. And so I think for engaged individuals, it means that for this, we need to make sure that we're looking at all of the different identities that might care about this topic. Even if it's something as simple as parents, it's something as simple as college students who may be working alongside a student who has chosen a different identity. So I think that that's really important.
So going off of engaged individuals, what does that look like for political opportunity?
Yeah, so again, you need this group of people who may be identifying in the category that we're wanting to make social change in. You'll also want those allies who may not identify in that category but care deeply about it. And so when you look at political opportunity, boy, there's a ton of that around today. And so because so many laws and ideas and institutions are being attacked or marginalized in some way, this is a time where something like this, there's political opportunity because not everybody agrees with what's going on in our society right now, particularly in the U.S. And so I think it's important that we look at this, even though we feel like so many things are falling apart around politics and laws. I think we look at this as an opportunity and say that gives us more reason to think about how we can then go to the third step, which is an organized infrastructure. When I think about social change, I think it's important that we accept and understand that it's more than just marching and that kind of thing. That's really what I call social justice, because that means we want something to happen quickly. An organized infrastructure requires you to think about, and me being the PR woman that I am, who's going to be your spokesperson for this movement? They may not necessarily be the brains behind it or the leader, but who can talk about it intelligently in the media, on social media? How does that play out, your key messaging and consistent messaging? So when I think about that part of it, organizing around what are our goals. You know, I think about the No Kings March, and we all talk about that as very visible, but I don't really know what the goal is. What is it that we want? You have a lot of people come out and march and cosplay and all of that, but it's, what does that really mean? What does that look like? What are we trying to get? Okay, are we trying to get more people out to vote? Then let's have voter registration or something else going on as we look at these marches and activities. So I think it's important when we look at those three elements that we really think about how it comes together in terms of even a strategic plan and how that plays out in then further a communications plan. And again, while all the time understanding what's going on with the cases, what's going on with people who are involved, and just being really clear about that, I think is absolutely important.
Yeah. So looking at LGBTQ plus rights, we've had a lot of progress with that over the years, but I'm interested in looking at historical examples of social change. What does this court decision say about where this LGBTQ plus rights is in its arc of the timeline of a social movement?
Well, I think, again, it says a lot about where we are in terms of what's happening in society, of course, but also it says that historic movements, there's always been setback. There's always been something that has caused them to maybe lose momentum or be discouraged. And so for me, it says it's right where it should be in many ways. Now, the challenge, I think, in today's world is that we have to really consider about when these setbacks happen, what do we really need to think about in terms of encouraging the engaged individuals and how do we keep them engaged? Because it can be very heartbreaking when we say, oh, the court struck this down, or, you know, they didn't really strike this down, but again, they sent it back and now we're going to be tied up. That's what these systems count on, is you losing momentum and you losing a desire to keep pushing. And so I think that that is what it says about this movement, is that we're very early still in it, even though we had things happen in the past historically that push things forward. Now we're fighting, almost starting over, and fighting for many of the same things, just in a different way. And I think the difference now is that we have more tools to communicate, and that can be helpful if we use them strategically.
Exactly. Is there anything that we didn't cover in this podcast that you would like to talk about?
Not really. I mean, I think it's just this idea of social change. I think it's important for us to always be talking about being in discussion, being even in debate and dialogue. I often say that one of our biggest fears is having conversations, and we need to do more of that, even if we disagree. And I think it's important that students, particularly college students, that you start to practice that skill. It's not easy, but you need to definitely practice those skills.
So moving on to the last question to close us up, if you could leave students with one thing to hold on to coming out of this decision, what would you tell them?
One thing, Amelia, come on, I don't know. No, I think that when I think about what I want college students to know, I would say first, I want them to care deeply about someone other than themselves. I want them to act locally first, because we often think about social change as, again, the big issues. We need to be around these big leaders and big spokespersons. Care deeply, act locally. Dare I say vote? It still matters. It's still part of the system that we have, and so voting is really important. And then I would say this idea, as I've mentioned before, change is everyone's responsibility. And it may not affect you now, but the way our society is structured, there's always an element that if we think of ourselves as more interconnected, it would change how we show up for each other. And so change is everyone's responsibility. When we care more deeply about someone other than ourselves, it causes us to want to say, well, I can be involved in that issue even though it's not directly affecting me. And then the last thing I would say is that social change requires awareness. Please, please, please take in some news. Not just entertainment news, not just TikTok news. Really take in some hard news and understand what are the top issues going on in the world, and particularly in the U.S. Things are changing so quickly, you need to stay on top of that news cycle. And then again, not being afraid to have courageous conversations around that. Courageous conversations involve, perhaps we'll disagree, But guess what? We can still talk about this, and maybe there's some points of agreement that we might find as we expand and explore and get to know each other. So that was more than one thing, I know, but I have so much to say about that. So that would be what I'd want to leave for college students to think about.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We've had a good conversation about Chiles v. Salazar and how that can impact social change going into the future and what viewers can do to stay on top of that. A resource that viewers can use to stay up to date on what's going on with this court case is my personal website, ameliametz.com. I have a series called Media Law for the Real World where you can read about any First Amendment or media law issue that speaks to your heart.
Excellent. Love it. Thank you for having me.